Welcome to American Legacies, where we explore incredible stories of the people who shaped the nation. From founders like Benjamin Franklin to creators like Walt Disney, barrier breakers like Rosa Parks to stars like Frank Sinatra. Whether they led revolutions, inspired generations, or changed the course of history, their stories are woven into the fabric of America. Join us as we uncover the triumphs, struggles, and legacies of the heroes of our country. Let's get started. When you hear the name Samuel Adams, you might think of a certain Boston beer. But Samuel Adams was far more than a brewer. He was an American statesman and a founding father of the United States. Often overshadowed by compatriots like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, Adams was nonetheless a pivotal figure in the American Revolution. He helped organize colonial resistance against British rule in the 1760s and 70s, stirred public opinion with passionate writings, and signed the Declaration of Independence. He later served as governor of Massachusetts, capping a career devoted to the cause of liberty. Samuel was born in Boston in the British colony of Massachusetts on September 16, 1722. He was one of 12 children, 9 of whom died in infancy, of Samuel Adams Sr. and Mary Fifield Adams. The Adams family were devout Puritans, belonging to the Congregational Church, and they lived on Purchase Street in Boston. Young Sam grew up in an atmosphere of religion and civic engagement. His father was a prosperous malt merchant and a deacon in the church, as well as an active local politician. The elder Adams was a leading member of the Boston Caucus, a political organization that worked to advance popular causes in town meetings and beyond. From an early age, Sam learned by his father's example that ordinary citizens, when organized, could have power in politics. This lesson stuck with him. Throughout his life, Sam Adams championed the participation of common people in government. Sam received an excellent education for his time. He attended Boston Latin School as a boy and entered Harvard College at the young age of 14. There he studied the classical curriculum, but also delved into the writings of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, who argued for natural rights and government by consent. These ideas resonated deeply with him. In 1740, he graduated with a bachelor's degree, and he stayed on to earn his master's at Harvard in 1743. For his master's thesis, the young Sam boldly argued the question whether it be lawful to resist the supreme magistrate if the commonwealth cannot otherwise be preserved. In essence, he asserted that it was legitimate to resist authority for the sake of the common good, a radical proposition in an era when questioning royal power was not taken lightly. This early statement of principle, hinting at justified rebellion against unjust rulers, foreshadowed his future role as an instigator of revolution. Another formative event for the Adams family occurred during Sam's youth. His father was involved in establishing a local land bank, an early paper currency venture, to help ease a money shortage in Massachusetts in 1739. The land bank issued notes backed by real estate, a populist measure opposed by wealthier interests. The venture alarmed the imperial authorities, and in 1741, the British Parliament outlawed the land bank and demanded its directors, including Sam's father, personally repay the debt. The elder Adams faced financial ruin and legal battles that lasted years. Defending the family estate from seizure became the young Sam's problem after his father's death in 1748. This experience left an impression. He saw firsthand how distant authorities could arbitrarily upend local efforts and livelihoods. It reinforced his instinct to question British interference in colonial affairs and to defend the rights granted to colonists under their own charter. After finishing his studies, Sam struggled to find a direction in life. He had considered becoming a lawyer, but his mother disapproved. Instead, he tried his hand in the business world. In 1743, he took a job at the counting house of Thomas Cushing, a prominent Boston merchant. But he didn't last long there. He was more interested in political debate than in balancing ledgers. His employer noted that Sam was too preoccupied with politics to make a good merchant. The young man's heart simply wasn't in commerce. Seeing his son unemployed, Sam's father stepped in to help him start a business of his own. He lent Samuel £1,000, a substantial sum, as startup capital. But this venture also ended in failure. He reportedly loaned half the money to a friend who never repaid it, and he squandered the rest through poor management. In the words of one historian, he was a man utterly uninterested in either making or possessing money. Indeed, later in life he even expressed pride in his frugality. "I glory in being what the world calls a poor man," he wrote, saying he had no envy of the rich. Such lack of financial acumen meant that by his mid-20s, Adams had failed as a businessman and had little to show in worldly wealth. After his misadventures in trade, he found himself working for his father's business, a malt house that produced malt for brewing beer. Several generations of Adamses had been maltsters by trade. Sam thus joined the family trade. Although later lore often styled him as a brewer, his role was primarily to make malt, an ingredient for beer. Years afterward, a political rival mocked him as Sam the Maltster. He did attempt to market finished beer at least once. A 1751 newspaper advertisement offered strong beer or malt for those who inclined to brew it themselves, to be sold by Samuel Adams at a reasonable rate. However, his attention to the business remained lackluster. Unsurprisingly, the malt house struggled under his management and eventually closed down. It seemed clear that making money would never be his forte or focus in life. While his economic prospects were shaky, Adams's personal life took shape in this period. In 1749, at age 27, he married Elizabeth Checkley, the daughter of his minister. Contemporaries described Elizabeth as an ideal woman of virtue and piety. The young couple set up house in Boston and eventually had 6 children. But tragedy struck repeatedly. Only 2 of their children survived beyond infancy. Then, in 1757, Elizabeth died after complications from childbirth, leaving Samuel a widower, with 2 surviving children, a son and a daughter. Deeply affected by the loss of his wife and several infants, he found solace and purpose increasingly in public life. In 1764, he married Elizabeth Wells, who would be his companion for the rest of his days. His second marriage was reportedly happy, though they had no children together. Even as he dealt with family responsibilities and grief, Sam was laying the groundwork for a political career. In 1747, he received his first minor public appointment as clerk of the Boston Market, a modest post. He also became active in Boston's town meetings, the democratic forums where local citizens debated and voted on issues. He aligned himself with the town's Popular Party, which opposed the pretensions of royal officials and defended the traditional rights granted by the colonial charter. In 1748, he and some like-minded young men launched a weekly newspaper, the Independent Advertiser, to voice their political ideals. He contributed anonymous essays that railed against any threats to liberty. He warned readers to be ever vigilant of their freedoms, and cited history, such as the fall of ancient Rome, as cautionary examples of republics losing their virtue. The paper only lasted about a year, but it marked the start of his career as a persuasive pamphleteer and propagandist for the colonial cause. A turning point for Sam came in 1756, when he was elected by the Boston town meeting to the position of tax collector. For the first time, at age 34, he had a steady income, albeit a modest one, from public office. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately for his political destiny, he was not an efficient tax collector. He often failed to collect all the taxes due, either out of leniency toward taxpayers who struggled to pay, or due to his habitual disorganization. By 1765, after nearly a decade on the job, his accounts were short by the enormous sum of £8,000. This liability technically fell on him, and in 1768, his opponents even secured a court judgment against him for a portion of the arrears, over £1,400. Friends helped cover some of the debt, and the town meeting forgave the rest, sparing him from ruin. Remarkably, the episode did not destroy his reputation. If anything, his neighbors seemed to appreciate his reluctance to press them for payment. He had become popular among Boston's working-class folks for his generosity or laxity in tax collection. Moreover, in carrying out his duties,
He had visited every corner of Boston and met people from all walks of life. He built a network of ordinary supporters, artisans, laborers, shopkeepers, who knew him as a friendly figure. These grassroots connections proved invaluable later when he needed to mobilize crowds and election votes. In essence, his very failures in business and as a tax collector helped forge his identity as a man of the people.
The end of the 7 Years' War in 1763 marked a new chapter in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies. To pay down the massive war debt and finance the ongoing defense of North America, the British government began enforcing old trade laws and introducing new taxes on the colonies. These policies soon ignited colonial opposition, and Sam rose to prominence as one of Britain's fiercest critics in Massachusetts. His political philosophy was rooted in the conviction that government's legitimacy flows from the consent of the governed. Thus, when Parliament imposed the Sugar Act of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765 on the colonies without their consent, he perceived it as a direct assault on colonial rights. He was no mere complainer about economic harm. He framed the issue in terms of rights and liberties. In response to the Stamp Act, a tax on all kinds of printed paper, he penned influential arguments asserting that taxation without representation violated the basic rights of British subjects. He warned that the Stamp Act threatened to annihilate the most valuable privileges of colonists, destroying their liberties at one blow. Such language helped shape colonial outrage into a constitutional debate about the limits of Parliament's authority. That same year, 1765, his activism propelled him into higher office. Boston voters elected the 43-year-old Adams to the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly. He quickly became a leader of the anti-Stamp Act faction in the legislature, working closely with firebrands like James Otis Jr. When other colonial assemblies proposed a unified response, Massachusetts sent his colleagues to what became the Stamp Act Congress in New York. Adams himself stayed in Boston, where he drafted official instructions to the Massachusetts delegates and penned resolves asserting the colonists' rights. He was one of the first American politicians to articulate the concept that natural rights and the colonial charters trumped parliamentary decrees, and that therefore the Stamp Act was unconstitutional. While lawyers and petitioners argued on paper, ordinary Bostonians took to the streets in protest. A group calling itself the Loyal Nine, precursor to the Sons of Liberty, coordinated demonstrations against the Stamp Act in Boston, such as hanging the stamp distributor in effigy and ransacking officials' houses. Sam was friendly with these activists and often met with them. Though he was not the one inciting mob violence, he later condemned the excesses of violent mobs. Instead, he played a shrewder role. He maintained a respectable front in the legislature and town meeting, all while privately encouraging popular resistance. This dual approach proved effective. Under pressure from colonial boycotts and unrest, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, a major victory for the colonies. He celebrated the repeal but cautioned that the fight was not over, especially since Parliament replaced the Stamp Act with a declaratory act, asserting its full power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Sam remained vigilant. The British soon gave him more to fight. In 1767, Parliament enacted the Townshend Acts, which imposed duties on various goods, like glass, paper, and tea, imported into the colonies. The principle was the same one he had just battled: taxes levied by a parliament in which Americans had no voice. As Massachusetts House Clerk, a post to which he was elected in 1766, he drafted a letter, the Massachusetts Circular Letter of 1768, calling on other colonies to join in opposition to the Townshend duties. In this document, which he co-authored with James Otis, Adams argued that only the colonial assemblies had the right to tax the colonists, and he urged a united American stand against the new taxes. The British ministry's reaction was swift and sharp. Lord Hillsborough, the American secretary, ordered Massachusetts to rescind the circular letter and directed the royal governor to dissolve the colonial assembly if it refused. Sam and his allies, seeing their free speech under attack, persuaded the Massachusetts House to defy the order. The Assembly overwhelmingly refused to take back the letter, even knowing this would provoke the governor to dissolve them, which he did.
True to Hillsborough's threat, British troops were soon dispatched to Boston in late 1768 to help enforce order and the Townshend laws.
For the next 18 months, Boston lived under British military occupation, an ominous presence that Sam railed against constantly in print. He wrote newspaper pieces under pseudonyms that stoked public resentment of the standing army in the city and recounted every incident of soldiers behaving badly. He also urged economic resistance, pressuring Boston merchants and consumers to boycott British imports until the Townshend duties were repealed. Tensions kept rising, egged on by the Sons of Liberty, which by now was a formal secret society of patriots that he cooperated with. Small clashes between citizens and redcoats became frequent. On March 5, 1770, this tense situation exploded into the Boston Massacre. That evening, British soldiers guarding the customs house fired into a taunting crowd, killing 5 colonists. In the aftermath, Adams helped orchestrate both the anger and the response. He quickly publicized the incident as a massacre of innocents, ensuring the event would inflame colonial opinion. Pamphlets and engravings, like Paul Revere's famous depiction, spread the story, partly thanks to networks he had a hand in. Yet at the same time, he took a role in managing the crisis so that it would not spiral further out of control. The very next day, he was part of a delegation that confronted Governor Thomas Hutchinson and the British military commander, demanding that the troops be withdrawn from Boston to avoid more bloodshed. Adams was firm, and the authorities agreed to remove the soldiers to an island fort in Boston Harbor, a concession that showed the potency of Boston's popular anger. He also insisted that justice be seen to be done according to law. To demonstrate colonial fairness, he wanted the British soldiers involved in the shooting to receive a fair trial in Boston, rather than revenge lynchings or drumhead courts. He even helped recruit his cousin, John Adams, and lawyer Josiah Quincy to serve as defense attorneys for the accused redcoats. John Adams later wrote that he took the case in part because Sam urged that protecting the soldiers' rights would show the world that America was guided by law, not mob rule. In the end, most of the soldiers were acquitted, with 2 lightly punished, a result that Sam publicly criticized as too lenient. Still, by handling the aftermath as they did, the Patriots under Adams's guidance turned the Boston Massacre into a propaganda victory rather than a trigger for chaos. Interestingly, after the massacre, there was a brief lull in the imperial crisis. Britain, hoping to calm tensions and restore trade, repealed the Townshend duties in April 1770, all except the tax on tea, which was kept symbolically. With that concession, and with the soldiers gone from Boston, many colonial merchants resumed importing British goods. Prosperity began to return. The period from 1770 to 1773 was later called a quiet period in Massachusetts politics. Many people thought the troubles of the 1760s were over. Sam did not share that complacency. He saw the partial repeal as a temporary truce at best, and he urged vigilance. When Boston merchants ended their non-importation agreement in 1770, he was bitterly disappointed. He kept the cause alive, largely through written words. In November 1772, he spearheaded the creation of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. This was a small group of citizens, tasked with drafting statements of colonial rights and grievances, and communicating with other towns and colonies. His committee in Boston circulated a persuasive declaration of rights, written mainly by him, and exposed British infringements, such as the plan for Britain to pay judges and officials salaries, which Adams argued would make those officials independent of colonial oversight. More than 80 Massachusetts towns quickly formed their own committees, and soon committees of correspondence sprang up in other colonies as well. This intercolonial network proved crucial in 1773 and 1774, when new crises arose, as it created a ready communication system among Patriot leaders. The relative calm shattered in 1773 with the Tea Act. This law was actually intended by Britain to assist the floundering East India Company,
by allowing it to sell tea directly in the colonies at a cheaper price, even with the tax, than smuggled Dutch tea. But Sam recognized the Tea Act's danger. If colonists bought the cheap tea, they would be implicitly accepting Parliament's right to tax them. He and other radicals resolved that the tea must not be landed in Boston at all. When 3 East India Company tea ships arrived in Boston Harbor in late November 1773, he helped organize mass meetings of citizens to pressure the ship's consignees and the royal governor Thomas Hutchinson. Thousands gathered at the Old South Meeting House, where he was a dominant speaker on the stage. The meetings passed resolutions demanding the ships depart with their tea, but Governor Hutchinson refused to grant them clearance to leave without paying the import duty. A stalemate ensued for about 2 weeks, as the ships sat idle. On December 16, 1733, the largest meeting yet convened at the Old South Meeting House, with over 5,000 people, a huge crowd in a town of 16,000. Sam chaired the meeting. News came that the governor still refused to relent, and that the tea ships were effectively trapped in harbor by British naval patrols. Around 6 p.m., he gave a prearranged cue. He rose and declared to the assembly, "This meeting can do no more to save the country." Those words, as one eyewitness put it, were scarcely uttered, when about 50 men in disguise, many of them Sons of Liberty, gave the loud war whoop signal and rushed out of the hall. By this signal, he effectively greenlit the direct action protest that followed. That night, groups of patriots dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded the 3 tea ships and methodically dumped 342 chests of British tea into the Boston harbor. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, destroyed a fortune in tea worth nearly £10,000 in a dramatic act of defiance. There is debate over how directly he was involved in planning the Tea Party. He did not dress up or go out to the ships himself as far as records show. However, he was unquestionably one of the chief instigators of the entire affair, from organizing the meetings that led to it, to possibly coordinating with the Sons of Liberty leadership. And he was quick to defend the tea destruction after the fact. Sam wrote that night in praise of Bostonians who had resisted the tea, saying, "Our enemies must acknowledge that these people have acted upon pure and upright principle." To him, the Tea Party was a principled stand against tyranny and corruption, not mere vandalism. The British government reacted to the Boston Tea Party with fury. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists grimly dubbed the Intolerable Acts. These laws punished Massachusetts by closing Boston's port, altering the colony's charter to reduce self-governance, protecting British officials from local trials, and permitting troops to be quartered in private homes. Instead of isolating Boston, the Intolerable Acts ignited sympathy throughout the colonies. Americans viewed Massachusetts as the canary in the coal mine. If Parliament could do this to Boston, no colony's rights were safe. Accordingly, in September 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, and Massachusetts sent Sam, along with John Adams and others, as delegates. Now 52 years old, with graying hair, he found himself working alongside representatives from 12 colonies. Many of these delegates were more conservative or hesitant than he, at least initially. He realized he needed to win them over gradually. According to some accounts, he carefully cultivated alliances with delegates from other regions, often by finding common ground in religion or mutual interests to build trust. One famous anecdote has Adams orchestrating a small patriotic demonstration during a prayer at the Congress's opening. The delegates from different colonies were strangers to each other and suspicious. When an objection arose to having an Anglican minister lead prayers, since Massachusetts Puritans distrusted Anglicans, he supposedly diffused the tension by passionately declaring he could join in prayer with any Christian, regardless of denomination. Whether apocryphal or not, the story reflects his role as a unifier at that crucial moment. At the First Continental Congress, Sam advocated for a firm stand against Britain's overreach. The Congress agreed on a boycott of British goods, the Continental Association, and sent a petition to King George III, while also advising Massachusetts to form a militia for defense. He likely had a hand in these measures behind the scenes. His political skills were evident.
He could be radical in principle, yet pragmatic in building consensus. Events soon overtook politics. In April 1775, the standoff in Massachusetts turned violent. On April 19th, colonial militia and British troops clashed at Lexington and Concord, just outside Boston, the first battles of the American Revolutionary War. Notably, Sam and John Hancock were present in Lexington. They had been staying at the Hancock-Clark House on the morning of April 19th. They were there because they had fled Boston to avoid arrest, as General Gage had ordered Patriot leaders rounded up. Paul Revere's legendary midnight ride on April 18th was aimed in part at warning Sam and John specifically of British troops marching out from Boston. The next morning, once gunfire erupted at Lexington Green, Adams witnessed the dawn of war. Far from being frightened, he was exhilarated. "Oh, what a glorious morning for America," he excitedly told Hancock, as the sounds of battle carried over the air. His elation came from his belief that the armed struggle would finally vindicate American liberty. This quote is inscribed on a plaque in Lexington today, though his exact wording has been debated. Soon after, Governor Gage offered a general pardon to all rebels who would lay down arms, except Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were explicitly excluded. Adams wore that exclusion as a badge of honor. It meant the British saw him as one of the revolution's ringleaders. With open war underway, Sam moved on to the national stage as a member of the Second Continental Congress, which assembled in Philadelphia in May 1775. All 13 colonies were represented, and the Congress's task was to coordinate the war effort and eventually to declare independence. In this body, he was in his element as a tireless committeeman and political strategist. Though not a great orator, his voice was described as quavering, and he left the dramatic speeches to others. He excelled at behind-the-scenes influence. One contemporary described him thus: "He eats little, drinks little, sleeps little, thinks much, and is most decisive and indefatigable in the pursuit of his objects." Indeed, he served on countless committees in Congress, often dealing with military logistics and foreign affairs, where his practical experience from Massachusetts proved useful. Sam also helped shape critical early decisions of the war. In June 1775, he supported the motion to appoint George Washington as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, a choice that helped bind the southern colonies, where Washington was from, to the New England-led war effort. He instinctively understood the need for unity, and often played the role of a whip, making sure the congressional delegates stuck together toward independence. Throughout 1775 and into 1776, Adams and his allies worked to move the Congress toward a clean break with Britain. Some members, especially at first, still hoped for reconciliation. He, however, had already privately accepted that independence was necessary and inevitable. He used correspondence and conversation to persuade moderates to come around. Thomas Jefferson later recalled that, if there was any palinurist to the Revolution, Samuel Adams was the man, comparing him to the navigator who steered the ship. Palinurus was the pilot of Aeneas's ship in classical legend. Jefferson, who is a generation younger, looked up to Sam as an elder statesman of the revolutionary cause. When the time came in the summer of 1776 to declare independence, he was wholeheartedly on board. On July 2, 1776, Congress voted for independence, and on July 4th, it approved the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Jefferson. Sam signed the Declaration proudly, one of the 56 founding fathers to do so. At 53 years old, he was one of the older signers. Only a few, like Benjamin Franklin, were his senior. John Adams later wrote that upon the signing, Sam rose and gave a brief, solemn speech, reminding the delegates of their responsibility to posterity, ever the voice of Puritan earnestness. During the war, Adams continued to serve in Congress until 1781, with some breaks. He contributed to the new nation's governance framework as well. He was part of the committee that drafted the Articles of Confederation, the first U.S. Constitution, in 1777. He favored a confederation of sovereign states with a weak central government, reflecting his long-standing wariness of concentrated power. The Articles of Confederation, which took effect in 1781, indeed gave each state significant autonomy,
a structure that aligned with his preferences and those of many at the time, though it later proved inefficient.
Outside of Congress, he kept involved in Massachusetts' own revolutionary government. He helped Massachusetts adopt a new state constitution in 1780 that included a strong Bill of Rights. Interestingly, that state constitution was largely written by his cousin John Adams, indicating that the Adams cousins worked in parallel on state and national levels to lay constitutional foundations.
Through the long years of war, Sam never lost faith in the cause, even in dark moments when American fortunes waned. He rallied others to persist and kept alive the ideals for which they fought. He was known to visit army encampments when possible, to encourage the troops, though unlike some members of Congress, he did not take on a formal military role. His battleground was the political front, maintaining unity, securing resources for the army, and preventing any backsliding or complacency among Americans. When the war ended in 1783, he returned to Massachusetts for good. Now in his early 60s, he could have retired as a venerable revolutionary hero. Instead, he continued in public service, driven by the same ideals that had animated his resistance to Britain. He served in the Massachusetts State Senate in the 1780s and became its president. In 1789, he was elected lieutenant governor of Massachusetts, essentially the deputy to Governor John Hancock. Yes, the same Hancock who had been his compatriot in 1775. Sam had known John for decades, though Hancock's vanity and lavish lifestyle were quite unlike Adams's austere ways. There is a famous contrast between the two. John was a wealthy gentleman fond of fine clothes, while Sam wore plain attire. On one occasion, Hancock arrived at a public event in a gold-trimmed velvet coat, which Adams quietly found absurd. Years later, when Adams was inaugurated as governor, he showed his character by riding, or rather walking, in a different style. A carriage had been provided for the ceremony, but he sent his wife in it and went to the State House on foot, at age 71, refusing any aristocratic show. After Hancock died in 1793, the 71-year-old Adams assumed the acting governorship and then won election as governor of Massachusetts in 1794. He served as governor for 3 one-year terms before stepping down. In those final political roles, he remained consistent in his principles. Although American politics had evolved into new partisan divisions, he identified with the Jeffersonian Republican faction, which championed states' rights and distrusted the Federalist push for a stronger central government. Yet Adams was not an extreme partisan. For example, when farmers in western Pennsylvania rebelled against federal whiskey taxes in 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion, President Washington called up militias to enforce the law. Despite Sam's general sympathy for protest, he supported Washington's action in this case because he believed violently defying the laws of a republic, as these whiskey rebels did, was unacceptable. He drew a sharp distinction between revolution against a tyrant government and resistance to a republic's duly enacted laws, a stance he had made clear back in the days of Shays's Rebellion as well. In Massachusetts, he remained popular among the common people, but the political tide in New England was turning Federalist in support of Washington's administration. His criticism of the Jay Treaty with Britain in 1796, for instance, was not well received by pro-trade Federalists in Massachusetts. Nearing his mid-70s and in shaky health, he decided not to seek re-election in 1797. He had developed a tremor disorder that made writing difficult and public life harder to manage. So at age 75, he retired from politics for good, closing a 4-decade chapter as one of America's leading patriots and public servants. He spent his last years quietly at home in Boston. Friends and neighbors still visited the old revolutionary. One can imagine him sharing stories of the dramatic events he lived through. On October 2, 1803, Sam died at the age of 81, concluding a life that had spanned from the reign of King George I to the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. He was interred in Boston's Granary Burying Ground, not far from his cousin John Adams, who would die in 1826. At the news of his death, tributes poured out for this founding father. The Independent Chronicle of Boston eulogized Samuel Adams as the father of the American Revolution, a recognition of how instrumental he had been in fomenting and and guiding the Patriot cause. Thomas Jefferson, reflecting years later, called him truly the man of the Revolution, meaning that in Jefferson's view, Sam was the quintessential driving force behind American independence. George Washington had earlier observed that Adams's energy and zeal were important in sustaining the revolutionary spirit when it might have flagged. His legacy among his contemporaries was certainly prominent. Leaders in other colonies were likened to him as a supreme compliment. For example, the patriot Charles Thompson was dubbed the Samuel Adams of Philadelphia, and Christopher Gadsden was sometimes called the Sam Adams of the South. This was because his name was synonymous with fervent resistance to tyranny. However, with admiration also came animosity. To British officials and American loyalists, he was painted as something of a villain. They saw him as the chief rabble-rouser who had stirred up the king's good subjects into rebellion. Massachusetts ex-governor Thomas Hutchinson never forgave Adams for undermining his authority. In his writings, Hutchinson portrayed him as a demagogic character assassin and harped on his early failures, his bankrupt brewery, the uncollected taxes, to suggest he had selfish motives. Another loyalist, Peter Oliver, a former Chief Justice in Massachusetts, wrote with fury about Adams, labeling him a manipulative, Machiavellian figure with a cloven foot, implying he was like the devil in disguise. These depictions were undoubtedly exaggerated by political bias, but they indicate how polarizing he was at the time. British General Gage had called him the most elegant writer of the revolutionaries, but also the most dangerous due to his ability to incite the masses. In the years after independence, Sam did not achieve the same level of national renown as some of his peers. He never held national executive office, nor did he leave behind extensive papers like Jefferson or Madison. For a time, in the early 19th century, historians neglected him, viewing him as an old-style Puritan in an age looking forward to new federal institutions. But his reputation rebounded later. His writings, letters, and articles were collected in the early 20th century, with editor Harry Cushing noting that the writings of no one of the leaders of the American Revolution form a more complete expression of the causes and justification of that movement than do those of Samuel Adams. Modern biographies, such as one by historian Pauline Maier and another more recently by Stacy Schiff, have highlighted Samuel Adams's vital role and complex personality. They portray him as a principled idealist who was also a pragmatic political operative, a combination that made him extraordinarily effective. What are the key takeaways from Samuel Adams's life? First, he exemplifies how ideas and advocacy can change history. He was not a general or a president. He was a man of words and organization. His pen and his ability to rally people were his weapons. Through persistent agitation, he helped a scattered colonial resistance coalesce into a revolutionary movement. He shows that passionate commitment to principles, in his case, liberty and self-governance, can sustain a person through decades of setbacks and finally triumph. Second, his life underscores the importance of grassroots political mobilization. He believed in the collective action of ordinary citizens, from town meetings to popular committees, as the bedrock of democracy. Long before community organizer was a term, he was one. He built networks, spread messages, and got people involved. Third, his story is one of personal sacrifice for the public good. He sacrificed financial gain, and indeed lived in relative poverty, devoting his energies to the cause. He withstood personal attacks and the constant threat of arrest or worse. His perseverance teaches the value of standing firm in one's convictions, even when it means facing great risks. In an era when many sought compromise or personal advancement, Sam was notable for putting the common cause first. Finally, his legacy is a reminder that the American Revolution was not only won on battlefields, but also in pamphlets, meeting halls, and the hearts of people. His name today remains well known. In an interesting twist of fate, the name Samuel Adams is now famously associated with a popular American beer,
The brewers chose it to evoke the rebellious spirit of 1773 Boston, when Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty plotted over pints in taverns.
Though he himself was a maltster more than a brewer, the use of his name in this context underscores his image as a patriot of the people. Even more enduring than the beer, however, are the principles he fought for. Every time Americans cherish their rights or challenge government injustice, they echo the legacy of Sam Adams. In summary, Samuel Adams lived an extraordinary life dedicated to the pursuit of liberty. From his birth in a tight-knit Puritan community to his role in inciting a revolution, and from the struggle to build a new republic to his final years as an elder statesman, his journey mirrors the birth pangs of the United States itself. Formal in his convictions, yet effective in a conversational, populist way of politicking, he remains a testament to how faith, perseverance, and strategic acumen can help achieve monumental change. Casual fans of history who delve into Samuel Adams's story will discover a man of firm principles, fiery anecdotes, and a legacy that ranks him among America's most important, if sometimes underappreciated, founding fathers.
Thanks for listening in on our journey into the fascinating life of Samuel Adams. Join us next time as we consider another of our country's greatest treasures here on American Legacies. See you then.